Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Jolanta Mickute, the Joseph P. Kazitskis Visiting Assistant Professor in Baltic Studies at the MacMillan Center. She's an assistant professor of history at Vytautas Magnus University in Lithuania, and her research examines political and cultural issues in the interwar period in Central and Eastern Europe. Today we'll talk with Professor Mickute about Zionist women in interwar Poland. Welcome, Professor Mickute.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Let's start with an overview of your book project. Tell us about it.
Okay, so I'm working on a book manuscript. It's a book project, and it's about nationalism, about modernity, and about Jewish women who are turning nationalist or Zionist. So it's geographically, I'm in interwar Poland. That's 1918 to 1939, and I'm looking at women who are modernizing as well as nationalizing in a country that's very multi-ethnic, and a country that has also inherited lots of imperial legacies from Tsarist Russia and the Habsburg Empire. So these women are trying to gain political and civil equality in their communities and their state, the Polish state. So I'm looking at their struggle and their attempts to gain presence and voice at both communal and national levels.
Okay, and what led you to study this topic?
Well, I'm from that part of the world. So I come from Lithuania, and I'm looking at the greater Jewish Lithuania, or Lita in Yiddish. And that's present day, all of present day Lithuania, parts of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Latvia. So I'm going back to sort of exploring the background of my country, the multi-ethnic background of my country, because at present, most of the countries in Eastern Europe are going sort of setting themselves on a very nationalist trend. So in a way, I'm going back to the legacies, to the multicultural legacies. And
okay, and what are some of those multicultural legacies? What are some of the ethnicities?
Well, we're looking at Jews, and we're looking at Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, and also Tatars and Karaites, and also different kinds of religious groups. That's Jews and Old Believers. We span the entire spectrum of Christianity. And in some countries in Eastern Europe, but I'm focusing on Lithuania, but in some countries there are also Muslim groups. Okay.
And how are you doing the research for the book? Tell us about your methodology.
Well, it's the research, because I'm focusing on women, and it's a pretty new and underdeveloped field in Eastern European history.
I can imagine.
So the research looks a bit like detective work. I have to go into sources, into archives, and look for sources in very innovative ways. That's why I ended up using what's called oral testimonies, memoirs, biographies, sources that were not considered for a long time as proper historical sources by the historical profession. Also sort of trying to tease out women's voices in different kinds of periodicals or the press that was left behind, because I'm looking at the interwar period. Unfortunately, all of that is very fragmented. As we know, Eastern Europe suffered a lot due to the Second World War. Warsaw, for instance, was burned to the ground. So many of the sources are gone, or very, very sort of scanty and fragmented. So I'm piecing a narrative together about Jewish women, nationalist or Zionist women in particular, in interwar Poland in that way.
Okay, yeah, it must be difficult, because I would imagine women during this time period, and perhaps particularly in that place, wouldn't necessarily have a voice that was captured well in any one particular place.
Very much so, very much so. But men were the intellectual and the cultural vanguard of many of the movements in both Western and Eastern Europe, including Poland. But women were always there. The reason that we don't know much about them is that they were not considered important, even though they were there helping their men, or they were doing lots of interesting stuff, but they were not, for instance, considered dangerous politically, and there's not that much police record on women, for instance, communists or women nationalists. But they were there doing lots of interesting things. And that's why I'm trying sort of to recover, put the women back into the stories that we have, sort of very male-dominated stories about interwar Poland.
Right, okay. So how would you characterize politics in these interwar years? I mean, how were some of the ways it shaped Jewish women during this time?
Well, we have interwar Poland that emerges out of, on the ruins of two major empires, Tsarist Russia and the Habsburgs. So it's a very interesting country that we have all of a sudden, and it has lots of minorities, both ethnic and religious, and then it has all these legacies that are sort of regional legacies, as I call them in my book project. So all these women, depending on where they come from, are very different, and they would provide their own answers to what their Zionist dream is all about.
Can you give us some examples? I mean, and I would imagine also it depends on how old you are during this time. I mean, if you're an older woman, I think your views are going to be a little bit different than a younger woman, per se.
Yes, women, Zionist women are very much so fractured along class and gender lines. So we have women, for instance, if we sort of go and look at the regional differences, if we look at Poland, sort of eastern Poland, what is called Kresy, or eastern borderlands, we have women who are a bit more socialist in their beliefs, and that's the Tsarist Russian legacy, because it's an area that's close to Soviet and new Bolshevik Russia, and they are poor, and they're just sort of dealing with a different political legacy and different realities as a result. If we look at women who are living in Krakow or Lviv at the time, and that's the former Habsburg Empire, they enjoyed a high degree of political freedom, that part of the area. And therefore women are a lot more moderate in their beliefs, so they are sort of usually adhering to the middle of the road kind of Zionism in their beliefs. Now, as to differences when it comes to age, yes, I've looked at women autobiographies. There's a really, I found a treasure trove of sources that were produced by the Jewish youth in interwar Poland, or basically all over interwar Eastern Europe. And it was Jewish women, young women and young men writing and sending their autobiographies to the YIVO Institute in Vilnius, Lithuania. And so they are giving me an entire spectrum of beliefs, of related to the class differences, the gender differences. I see that the older generation of women is a lot more traditional in their feminist beliefs. They're still, looking at women's roles and responsibilities through, I think, a very traditional prism. So they are getting themselves involved into philanthropic activities, which can be seen as an extension of women's roles, as mothers, as caretakers, as those who take care of young people, of elderly, of the sick. Now, the younger women, I think, are more in the Zionist women that I'm looking at, and the Zionist women's organizations that I sort of explore. They are a lot more individualistic. They're also saying that we want to be treated as individuals, not just as women, through our role and function of sort of motherhood, of our childbearing ability. So they are a lot more sort of modern, I wouldn't say modern, but more advanced and more sort of progressive in their views.
What does it mean to be a Zionist woman during this time period?
Well, it's a very good question, and you would get very different answers depending on who you ask. So as I looked at these very different kinds of sources, someone would say, well, let me begin with one major sort of important fact. Belonging to one movement didn't mean that you're going to stay with that movement for the rest of your life. So political allegiances, they shifted, even in the course of 2 decades. So women could, start as Bundists, which was a socialist national Zionist organization that wanted to create Jewish autonomy in Poland, where Jews were lived, and were not looking somewhere outside of Poland for a new Jewish homeland like Zionists did. So some of these women would switch from Bundism to Zionism, and then to communism sometimes, and then go back to Zionism. So for them, they had their own reasons for doing that.
What were the reasons? Could you cite any?
Well, some of them would look for new ways to associate themselves, for new kinds of affiliations, because they wanted to leave the domestic realm, especially in the case of women. They didn't want to stay in what they called the Jewish ghetto, very openly, in Yiddish or Polish, and they were turning bilingual. And that's sort of another feature of what I call the younger generation of Zionists. Some of them wanted to advance their careers. Some of the Zionist organizations had sports chapters, and they excelled in sports, for instance. So that was one of the reasons they wanted to join the Zionist movement. Some of the reasons can be completely trivial. Some of them liked just to hang out with boys, which was not normal. At the time, you had to, to be with women. The women were leaving the domestic sphere, and the parents were scared. So they said, oh my God, they are going to this particular Zionist organization, and nobody's supervising them at their dance parties, at their lectures. Boys are mingling with girls, and that sort of was one of the concerns of their mothers and fathers. But of course, there were also very staunch Zionists coming from families that had a very long Zionist tradition that went back all the way to the late 19th century. So the spectrum, of reasons as to why they joined was very, very wide.
And how did the Zionist women's movement emerge, and did feminism play a role in that? I mean, was it, a way for women to seek independence? And was there a backlash as a result of that?
That's a great question. Well, the Zionist women's involvement in the movement started early enough. Well, basically, with the first Zionist conference, there were women participating in at the first Zionist, the first Zionist Congress. But these were women who were very ideologically motivated. I think a larger number of women started joining the Zionist movement, I think, with the emancipation movement, when women got their right to vote and be elected into a poll in 1918. So the Great War was, I think, that one big moment in the history of the Zionist women's movement, because women could all of a sudden participate in elections or vote in elections. And this period is very much wrought with antagonisms and sort of ironies, I would say sometimes, because, for instance, in interwar Poland, Jewish women could vote and be elected to municipal positions, and even one of the Zionist women I look at was elected to the Polish parliament in interwar years, but they couldn't get into their own kehillas, which were self-governing Jewish institutions. So at the communal level, they could not get any official representation by women.
That's
of
very
course, they were unofficially consulted behind the doors, backstage, about issues related to children, related to the elderly, women's issues as well. But at their own communities, they actually had no women representatives, whereas the Polish state, because of the changes, many big changes that the Great War brought in, gave women the right to vote. So there's a number of factors that propelled the Zionist women's participation in the Zionist movement.
Are there any women in particular who stick out that you've studied?
Yes, one of them I already mentioned, the parliament member, Róża Meltzerowa, or Meltzer in Polish. She was a very well-educated woman from what's called Galicia, or that's the part of Poland that once belonged to the Habsburg Empire. So she spoke both Polish and German, was very well educated, had studied in Leipzig, Vienna, and Berlin. And then she came back and got very much involved in politics. At first, of course, in different kinds of social activities and philanthropic activities in her own city, and then she sort of applied her expertise in other areas as well, and then she got elected. But she was not re-elected for the second term. And even if she tried, but she just, for many reasons, political and social, she couldn't. And there's another very interesting character that I look at, and it's a woman who is extremely feminist and ahead of her times, and that's Rakowska. She's a translator. She knows French, but she is, unlike many other women, is a Yiddish speaker. And she comes from what I call the Kresy Eastern Borderlands. That's close to where I come from, Lithuania. And she is saying that women and men had to share household chores. That you cannot just grant women rights formally. Politically, you can give women rights. You can say, okay, we'll fight for women's social equality. But she said, let's share this work that women do at home as well, because women can get all these rights, but then it's a double burden they're doing. They have a job, but then at home they have a second job at home.
How is she perceived?
She
during her time?
She was considered a radical feminist, but she also was a celebrity in Warsaw, which was the capital of Poland and still is. She, I think, didn't care much about public opinion because she divorced her first husband. That she married through shidduch, arranged marriage, because the marriage was not working. At some point, she established her own school for girls, and then she married to a guy that was a lot younger than she was, and it seems that she didn't sort of concern herself much.
So did she have a wealthy background? Did she come from money?
No,
really.
She was not coming from a wealthy family, and that's part of her, I think, dislike of women who were coming from richer families, who represented what you called salon or bourgeois Zionism, because they were not very well acquainted with the masses of Jewish women. And there is this strong, I'd say, tension that existed between Zionist women of different social backgrounds. So the Zionist vanguard, or the Zionist ideologues, were usually women who were coming from middle-class, upper-class families, and they were well-educated. In a way, they didn't know how to speak to the masses of Yiddish-speaking Jewish women, who were a lot more socialist and, I'd say, a lot more radical when it came to their rise as individuals, because they were influenced kind of bit by socialist ideas.
Interesting. How did the Zionist women interact with other women of different faiths? And was there a push for feminism overall in Poland during this time?
Yes. Polish women are going feminist too. Okay. All of the groups are going feminist. Okay. Of course, there's a lot of pushback. There's quite a bit of hysteria about this new woman, the modern woman, and both Polish language and Yiddish language, Jewish and non-Jewish dailies. Now, women's participation in the public domain is, I think, is controversial, to say the least. Many of the men basically are saying that women are not ready, that they are not skilled enough to participate in politics, in modern politics, but how will they learn to participate if no one is letting them in, right?
They're still saying that today.
So many of these arguments that I see cropping up in interwar years, they are again cropping up in the 21st century.
Yes, talk about that a little bit.
Well, we now have Eastern Europe that has been independent from the USSR for about 27 years. So we are going into the third decade of independence. Interwar years, well, those were 2 decades of independence. And now we, again, are kind of recycling these very same arguments that I look at in my work, like that women should stay at home, should be homemakers mostly. And there are certain kinds, of course, religious arguments, social arguments, political arguments that are employed in present day Eastern Europe. But all of this has to do with the family, with the conception of the family, the locus, I'd say, of power relations and distribution. So we're going back to interwar debates about divorce, about contraception, about abortion. And all of these debates are there in interwar years because it's a very new thing, but it's also related to the emancipation ideas about women.
Right.
So they're also, again, in Poland, as we know, Poland has just recently elected a very conservative government that has tried to put a total ban on abortion, a complete ban. No matter what happens to a woman, there would be no abortion, period. So some of these debates I can see sort of can be easily traced back to what was going on in interwar years, and the nationalist discourse too.
Right.
The nationalist discourse, because Poland in interwar years was a multi-ethnic country, but they posited Poles as that titular primary identity that everyone sort of had to aspire to. So at some point, many of the people were pushed to choose, what identity they wanted to belong to, even though many of the people at the time were bilingual already, or even trilingual in some places.
And so ultimately, what do you conclude in your book?
Well, I think when I started my research and started reading all the sources I was finding, I was a little bit disappointed with what the women's movement achieved and the Zionist women was achieving at the time. But now as I look back and as I see what's happening these days, I think that we are actually building on the achievements of these women, and then we should not belittle what they achieved. at that period, because they were coming from a completely different background and sort of the historical background as well. Women's presence in the public domain was so unusual, and that's something we take for granted these days. So I think I need to take a step back and sort of try to avoid what we call historical hindsight as much as possible, because their achievements are actually quite impressive.
Okay, very good. It's been wonderful talking with you today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
For more information about Professor Mickute and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.